On the morning of October 16, 1972, at a few minutes past 9, a twin-engine Cessna 310 rolled down a runway in Anchorage, Alaska, carrying one of the most powerful men in the United States government. Hale Boggs was the majority leader of the House of Representatives, second in command of the entire chamber, and he was in Alaska to campaign for a young congressman named Utqiagvik. The flight to Juneau was supposed to take about 3.5 hours. It crossed a stretch of country that pilots already spoke about carefully, a wedge of mountains, icefields, and gray water where the weather can close like a door. The Cessna climbed out over the Utqiagvik Mountains into cloud, and no confirmed trace of that airplane or of the 4 men aboard it has ever been found. Not a wing, not a seat cushion, not a bone. Draw a line on a map from Utqiagvik at the top of Alaska down to Anchorage and then southeast to Juneau, and you enclose the region some people call the Alaska Triangle. Inside that wedge, according to figures reported by Alaska's Department of Public Safety, thousands of people have been reported missing over the past several decades, and the state's missing persons rate has run at roughly double the national average. In some years, Alaska has recorded on the order of 4 missing persons reports for every 1,000 residents in a state with fewer people than the city of San Francisco, spread across an area a fifth the size of the entire lower 48. Most of those cases have ordinary, painful explanations. People found, people returned, people lost to rivers and cold in ways the record eventually explains. But a stubborn number of them do not. Tonight I want to walk you through 7 of them. 7 people, and in some cases whole planeloads of people, who entered that triangle and did not come out, spread across 70 years, from a military transport with 44 souls aboard to a mother who walked down a beach in Nome in 2020 and never walked back. And I will tell you this now, so you know it is coming. One of these 7 cases finally received an answer. The answer arrived in 2022, nearly half a century after the man vanished, and it required a hunter, a skull on a riverbank, and a genealogy database to deliver it. What that answer revealed about how this land takes people is, in its own quiet way, harder to sit with than the mystery was. Here is what this episode will cover in order. First, the full story of the Boggs flight, the 39-day surge that followed it, and the federal law that exists today, because that airplane was never found. Second, the January 1950 disappearance of a military transport carrying 44 people, which triggered one of the largest searches in North American history and recovered nothing at all. Third, the mechanism, because the triangle is not magic, and the real reasons this land swallows aircraft and hikers are documented, physical, and stranger than the folklore. Fourth, the case of the wilderness instructor who was living alone in a cabin in the Brooks Range foothills when he stepped outside and vanished, and the case of the runner who disappeared in the middle of a race in front of thousands of spectators on a mountain above a town. And fifth, the resolved case, the one answer the land has surrendered, and exactly what the DNA showed when it came back. A word about this channel before we begin. The Treeline tapes works from the public record, from contemporary news accounts, official search reports, and statements the families themselves have made. These are real people, several of them with relatives still waiting for word, and every case tonight is told with that in mind. Where the record is uncertain, I will say so. So let us go back to that runway in Anchorage. Case 1. Hale Boggs was 60 years old in October of 1972, a Louisiana Democrat who had served in Congress for decades, had helped shepherd landmark legislation through the House, and had sat on the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of President Kennedy, one of only 7 men in the country asked to sign that report. Utqiagvik was 40, a first-term congressman from Alaska fighting a close re-election against a Republican challenger named Don Young, and Boggs had flown north to stump for him at a fundraiser in Juneau that evening. With them that morning were Beggich's aide, Russell Brown, and the pilot, a 38-year-old named Don Jones, who was regarded as one of the more experienced bush pilots in the state, with thousands of hours in Alaskan conditions. And here the record offers one of those details that historians have turned over ever since. That very month, Johns had an article in print in Flying magazine, a piece about winter flying titled, of all things, "Ice Without Fear," in which he wrote with breezy confidence about handling airframe icing, the exact hazard forecast along his route that morning. The Cessna 310 was a fast, capable twin, but it reportedly carried no working emergency locator transmitter, and there are accounts suggesting its survival gear was minimal. In 1972, no law required either. The route from Anchorage to Juneau runs down through Portage Pass and along the coast of Prince William Sound, then across some of the most heavily glaciated terrain in North America, with the Gulf of Alaska on one side and the St. Elias icefields on the other. Terrain where an aircraft in trouble has almost nowhere flat, soft, or warm to go. The forecast that morning was poor. Contemporary reports describe low ceilings, icing conditions, and turbulence along the coastal route, the kind of forecast that grounded other pilots that day. Johns filed his flight plan, departed at around 9, and made no distress call that anyone ever received. When the aircraft failed to arrive in Juneau, the response began within hours, and it grew into something the country had rarely seen. The search for the Boggs plane ran for 39 days. Military accounts from the time describe roughly 40 military aircraft and dozens of civilian planes flying grid patterns over an area eventually estimated at 325,000 square miles, which is larger than the state of Texas. The Air Force reportedly flew an SR-71 reconnaissance jet over the route, a plane built to photograph Soviet installations from 80,000 feet, now pointed at the glaciers of the Alaskan coast with cameras that could resolve objects on the ground from extreme altitude. High-resolution imagery was analyzed frame by frame. Coast Guard cutters worked the shoreline of Prince William Sound. Volunteers walked beaches. Psychics wrote letters, and at least one tip was reportedly taken seriously enough that searchers checked the coordinates. And in 39 days of searching, across an area larger than Texas for an airplane carrying the second-ranking member of the House of Representatives, they found nothing that could be confirmed as wreckage. On November 24th, the search was called off. Both Boggs and Baggage were re-elected while officially missing, which may be unique in American political history, and both seats were later declared vacant. The aftermath rippled for half a century. Boggs's widow, Lindy, won his Louisiana seat and served 9 terms in her own right. Don Young won the special election for Baggage's seat and held it for 49 years, becoming the longest-serving Republican in the history of the House. Baggage's sons went into politics themselves, one becoming a United States Senator, and a grandson, Nick Baggage III, now holds the very Alaska seat his grandfather disappeared from. An entire generation of American politics grew out of a flight that lasted, at most, a few hours. Hold on to one detail from this case because it matters for everything that follows. Not a single piece of that airplane has ever been confirmed found, and yet the disappearance changed the law of the entire country. Within weeks of the search's end, Congress passed legislation requiring emergency locator transmitters, ELTs, aboard most civilian aircraft in the United States, small battery-powered beacons that activate on impact and broadcast a distress signal to searchers and, in later decades, to satellites. Every ELT that has ever led rescuers to a downed plane in the 50 years since, and there have been thousands of activations, exists in part because this one airplane was never found. I will come back to why even 325,000 square miles of searching can fail, because the answer is not mysterious. The answer is the land itself, and once you understand it, every other case tonight becomes more comprehensible and, honestly, more unsettling. But first, understand that the Boggs flight was not the beginning. 22 years earlier, the Triangle had already taken 44 people at once. Case 2. On January 26, 1950, a Douglas C-54 Skymaster, a big 4-engine military transport, the same type that had carried the Berlin airlift on its back the year before, lifted off from Elmendorf Air Force Base outside Anchorage, bound for Great Falls, Montana. Aboard were 8 crew and 36 passengers, most of them servicemen heading home. At least one of them, according to accounts from the time, traveling with word of a new baby waiting for him. There were also reportedly 2 civilians aboard, including a woman. About 2 hours into the flight, the crew made routine radio contact near the Yukon border, in the vicinity of a place called Snag, which holds the record for the coldest temperature ever measured in North America, 81 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, recorded there in February of 1947. Cold so deep that residents said they could hear their own breath freeze with a hissing sound as it left their mouths. The transmission was ordinary. Nothing about it suggested trouble. It was also the last one. The search that followed was, by the accounts of the period, among the largest peacetime search operations ever mounted on this continent to that point. American and Canadian forces together put dozens of aircraft over the route, by some accounts as many as 85 planes and thousands of personnel, day after day, in midwinter conditions, temperatures far below 0, a few hours of usable light, crews scanning millions of acres of spruce forest and mountain under fresh snow. Ground parties went in on foot, and by dog team where tips warranted it. They searched for weeks, ultimately covering by some estimates 350,000 square miles. 2 searchers reportedly died in a crash during the effort, which is its own grim arithmetic. The search costing lives the missing plane could no longer give back. In the C-54, an airplane with a wingspan of over 117 feet carrying 44 people was never found, not in 1950, and not since. It remains one of the largest groups of American service members ever lost without a trace outside of wartime at sea. Somewhere between the Alaska border and the Yukon interior, 75 years of snow has been falling on whatever remains, and no one alive knows where. So now let us stop and ask the honest question, the one this whole episode turns on. How? How does a 4-engine military transport vanish so completely that the combined air forces of 2 countries cannot find it? How does a congressman's plane evade an area search larger than Texas? Folklore has answers, and I will give them to you fairly. Some writers point to the Alaska Triangle's magnetic anomalies, and it is true geologists have documented irregularities in the region's magnetic field. And it is true that in high latitudes a magnetic compass grows sluggish and less trustworthy, because the horizontal pole that swings a compass needle weakens as you approach the magnetic pole, and the declination, the gap between magnetic north and true north, runs to 15 or 20 degrees across much of the state. But most aviation experts will tell you the measurable effect on navigation is small, and pilots of the air knew about it, charted it, and compensated for it as a matter of basic training. The real mechanism is less romantic and far more powerful. It has 3 parts. The first part is scale. Alaska covers more than 660,000 square miles, and the overwhelming majority of it has no roads at all. More than 80% of Alaskan communities are not connected to any highway system, which is why the state has roughly 1 registered pilot for every 60 or so residents, the highest concentration in the nation, and why small planes there are not a hobby but a bus service. When a plane goes down between Anchorage and Juneau, it does not fall into a countryside where a farmer might see smoke. It falls into terrain where the nearest human being may be 100 miles away, where no one is coming past next week or next year or next decade. Search planners talk about probability of detection, the odds that a crew flying a grid actually spots a target that is inside their grid, and in broken, shadowed, snow-covered mountain terrain that probability for a small aircraft can fall well below 50% on any given pass, which means a searched square is never truly a cleared square. A crumpled aluminum airframe painted white, resting in a boulder field of gray and white scree, is nearly invisible from a search plane flying at even a few hundred feet, and search pilots have said as much for generations. The land does not need to hide anything. It only needs to be as big as it is. The second part is ice. That corridor between Anchorage and Juneau crosses one of the largest non-polar concentrations of glacier ice on Earth. The Bagley icefield alone runs over 100 miles long, and the Juneau icefield sprawls across some 1,500 square miles and feeds close to 40 major glaciers. Glaciers are not solid floors. They are riven with crevasses, some of them 100 feet deep and more, roofed over with snow bridges that will hold a raven and nothing heavier. An aircraft that strikes a glacier in low visibility can punch through into a crevasse and be roofed over by the next storm, And after that, the glacier begins to move, carrying the wreck inside itself, grinding it, burying it deeper, sometimes for a century before the ice discharges its cargo at the terminus. This is not speculation. It has happened, and we have watched it happen. In March of 1948 at Northwest Airlines DC, 4 carrying 30 people, mostly merchant seamen heading home, flew into the upper slopes of Mount Sanford in the Wrangell Range, and the wreck was almost immediately buried by snow and swallowed by the glacier below the impact point. For 49 years it was simply gone, gathering legends about lost gold aboard. Then, in 1997, 2 pilots who had spent years methodically searching found wreckage emerging from the glacier ice thousands of feet below the crash site, delivered back to the surface by half a century of slow flow, and investigators were eventually able to recover and identify human remains. The mountain had held those men for 49 years and then, on its own schedule, handed them back. Aviation historians have suggested for decades that the Boggs Cessna may be inside a glacier right now, migrating slowly toward the sea. If that is true, it is entirely possible that one day, long after everyone who remembers the search is gone, the ice will simply hand the airplane back too. The third part is weather and time. The Gulf of Alaska is a storm factory, one of the most active low-pressure breeding grounds on the planet, hurling moist Pacific air against coastal mountains that wring it out as staggering quantities of snow, in some passes 500 inches and more in a season, and conditions can collapse from flyable to lethal in under an hour. Winds funneled through mountain gaps, the sudden violent gusts Alaskans call willywaws, can exceed hurricane force with almost no warning. That same weather then shuts down the search, and every day the search is grounded. Snow is falling on the evidence. A wreck that might have been spotted on day 1 is a white mound among white mounds by day 5. Searchers in 1950 and 1972 were not being careless. They were racing a landscape that erases faster than humans can look. And remember, before 1972 there was no ELT crying out from the wreckage. There was only silence. And several 100,000 square miles of places the silence might be coming from. Now hold that mechanism in your mind, because the triangle does not only take airplanes, and it does not only take strangers. Case 3. In August of 1958, Clarence Rode, the regional director of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska, and one of the most experienced aviators in the territory, took off in a Grumman Goose, an amphibious twin, to survey the Brooks Range in the far north, counting sheep and caribou, and checking on the country he had spent his career administering. With him were his 22-year-old son Jack, and an enforcement agent named Stanley Fredericks. He had effectively built the Fish and Wildlife Service's Alaskan air operation, and he knew this country as well as anyone alive. When the goose failed to return, the search became once again one of the largest in Alaska's history to that point, by some accounts covering on the order of 300,000 square miles, with Rode's own pilots, friends, and colleagues personally scouring the passes he was known to use, men who knew his habits, his fuel range, his favorite routes. Nothing. For 21 years, nothing. The service he led eventually named a national wildlife range in his honor, the institutional equivalent of a headstone without a grave. And then, in 1979, 2 hikers walking a remote pass in the Brooks Range, in country that is now part of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, came over a rise and found the crumpled remains of a Grumman goose lying against a mountainside, with personal effects and papers among the wreckage confirming who had been aboard, and the position of the wreck confirming what the weather charts had always suggested. The plane had flown into terrain, likely in clouds, striking the slope not far below the crest of the pass, and all 3 men had died on impact. It had lain there in a searched region, within the search grids, for 21 years, while aircraft passed overhead and found nothing. Run the numbers on that. Some of the best bush pilots in the world, searching for one of their own, with strong information about his intended route, achieved a probability of detection over 21 years of 0, until 2 people on foot happened to walk within eyesight. I told you the mechanism was more unsettling than the folklore. The Rode case is the proof. The land had not even hidden the plane. It had simply been itself, and that was enough. Case 4 moves us from the air to the ground, and it may be the most confounding of all 7, because this man did not vanish in a wilderness. He vanished at a public event, on a marked route, above a town full of people. Every 4th of July, the town of Seward, Alaska, holds the Mount Marathon race, a tradition that goes back to 1915 and is sometimes called the oldest mountain race in America. A brutal sprint from downtown to the top of a 3,000-foot mountain and back, up slopes of loose shale and cliff bands so steep that racers descend in barely controlled slides, finishing bloodied often enough that it is part of the race's lore. The town's population roughly triples on race day, with tens of thousands of spectators lining the streets and the lower mountain. In 2012, a 66-year-old Anchorage man named Michael Lemaitre was running it for the first time. He had won his entry in a lottery, and by every account he was thrilled to be there. His family waited for him near the finish. Because the field starts in waves, and he was among the later, slower runners, the crowds and race officials near the top were beginning to disperse as he climbed, and low cloud was moving across the upper mountain. A race official near the turnaround point reportedly saw him approaching, roughly 200 feet below the top, still moving, still climbing, and by some accounts called out encouragement to him. That official is, as far as the public record shows, the last person known to have seen Michael Lemaitre. He never crossed the turnaround. He never came down the mountain. Search teams, helicopters, dogs, and volunteers worked the slopes for days, then weeks, on a mountain you can see from the street in Seward, a mountain that had a town at its foot and race spectators on its lower flanks that very afternoon. He has never been found. The prevailing theory is that in fog, off the marked route, he may have gone over one of the cliff bands or into one of the steep, brush-choked gullies that seam the mountain's face, terrain that can conceal a person a few dozen yards from a search line, and searchers who have worked that mountain have said the vegetation in those gullies is dense enough to hide a vehicle. It is worth saying that the same race day produced other tragedies, including a runner who suffered catastrophic injuries in a fall near the base, and in the aftermath, the race changed its rules, imposing cutoff times on the ascent and requiring first-time racers to demonstrate that they had actually been on the mountain before, changes that exist, in part, because of Michael Lemaitre. His family has spoken publicly over the years with extraordinary grace. But the plain fact remains, a man disappeared in the middle of a sporting event, within sight of a town, inside the triangle, and more than a decade of searching has not produced so much as a shoe. Case 5. In the autumn of 2012, the same year Lemaitre vanished, a 31-year-old German-born wilderness instructor named Thomas Seibold was living at a remote cabin near the Ambler River in the foothills of the Brooks Range, hundreds of miles from any road, north of the Arctic Circle. Seibold taught at the Teaching Drum Outdoor School, a traditional living skills school in the North Woods of Wisconsin, where students learn to live for months at a time with primitive equipment, and he was in Alaska deliberately, at the invitation of friends of the school, to live close to the land through the turn of the season, through freeze-up, one of the most beautiful and most dangerous windows in the Arctic year. He was, by all accounts, competent, careful, and profoundly happy to be there. And the letters and messages he sent south before contact ended reportedly reflected exactly that. Sometime in October, he vanished from the cabin. When contact was lost and searchers eventually reached the site, they found his belongings in place and no sign of a struggle. No note, no clear trail. Troopers flew the river corridor and volunteers, including people from the school who traveled north from Wisconsin, searched the surrounding country. One working theory, given the season, is that he may have gone through early ice on the river, and it is worth understanding what October ice actually is in that country. During freeze-up, a river skins over with ice that thickens unevenly, thin over fast water, thicker in the slack, and it can look identical from above. A smooth gray sheet that will hold a person's weight for 5 steps and fail on the 6th. Cold water incapacitates in minutes. And a river under ice does not return what it takes to the place it took it. It carries what falls through beneath the sheet, delivers it far downstream in the spring, or wedges it under a cutbank or nowhere at all. But that is a theory. The record simply stops. A man was in a cabin and then he was not. And the country around that cabin is the size of a European nation and holds its own council. Case 6 is the most recent, and I want to handle it with particular care because this is not a historical mystery. This is an open case with a family still waiting. On the 1st of September 2020, a 33-year-old Utqiagvik woman named Florence Okpealuk was seen on West Beach in Nome on the coast of the Bering Sea at the far western edge of the triangle. Florence was a mother with a young daughter. West Beach at that time had a scattering of tents used by seasonal gold miners, small-scale operators who worked the beach sands the way miners have at Nome since the gold rush of 1899. And the last confirmed sightings placed her in that area. And here's the detail I told you was coming. When searchers went through the beach, they found her belongings in one of the tents, including, according to reporting at the time, her shoes and socks. Her phone and other personal items were reportedly there as well. She had walked into that stretch of beach with everything a person carries, and whatever happened next happened without them. Local volunteers searched the beach and the tundra behind it. Alaska state troopers searched. The FBI joined the case, which is itself notable, and posted a reward of $10,000 for information. As of the making of this episode, Florence Okpealuk has not been found, and no one has been charged in connection with her disappearance. Her case is often discussed within a larger and well-documented crisis, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, because the numbers here are not ambiguous. A study funded by the National Institute of Justice found that more than 4 out of 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women experience violence in their lifetimes. Federal analyses have found that Native women in some parts of the country are murdered at many times the national average, and researchers who have tried to count urban cases found hundreds that appeared in no comprehensive federal database at all. A gap Congress has only recently begun to address with legislation like Savannah's Act, which passed into law the very year her Florence Okpealuk. In western Alaska, those numbers are not statistics, they are neighbors, and Nome in particular has had a long, painful, publicly documented reckoning over how disappearances of Alaska Native people have historically been investigated there. If you remember one name from tonight, let it be hers, because unlike a Cessna in a glacier, this is a case a human being somewhere may be able to solve. Someone on that beach knows more than has been said. And that brings us to case 7, the one I promised you at the start, the one case out of 7 where the triangle finally gave an answer back. In the mid-1970s, a young man from upstate New York named Gary Frank Southerden set off on a hunting and trapping trip along the Porcupine River in the remote northeast of Alaska near the Canadian border, country where the river winds for hundreds of miles through spruce flats and bluffs, and where a trapper in the 1970s might go an entire season without seeing another human being. He was in his 20s, adventurous, drawn north the way so many are. He never came home. For his family, the record went silent for decades. No remains, no gear, no answers, just the specific grinding weight that the families in every one of tonight's cases carry. The absence of a body to bury. Then, in 1997, more than 20 years after he vanished, a hunter working the bank of the Porcupine River found a human skull. It was recovered, examined, and cataloged, but the technology of the 1990s could not put a name to it. Forensic DNA work in that era needed a suspect or a family member to compare against. A one-to-one match, and with no name to start from there was no. Sit with what that resolution actually tells us, because it is the closest thing tonight has to a thesis. For almost 50 years, Gary Southerden was a mystery. A vanished man, the kind of case that gathers theories the way the others still do, and had his story been told on a channel like this one in 1990, it would have sat comfortably alongside talk of anomalies and triangles. And the answer, when it finally came, contained no triangle, no anomaly, no conspiracy. The answer was that the wilderness is exactly what it appears to be: vast, indifferent, and inhabited. And that it can end a human story in an afternoon and then hold the evidence in plain sight on a riverbank for 2 decades before anyone happens to walk past, and hold the name for 2 decades more, until human ingenuity caught up. if 6 of tonight's cases ever receive their answers. The southern case suggests what those answers will probably look like. Not stranger than we imagined, simpler, sadder, and hidden only by distance, ice, and time. It also suggests where those answers will come from: a hiker cresting a rise, a glacier reaching its terminus, a hunter on a riverbank, a database that did not exist when the person vanished. So where does that leave the ledger? 7 cases. The Boggs Cessna, 4 men, never found, a search larger than Texas, and a federal ELT law standing as its only monument. The C-54, 44 souls, 75 winters of snow deep in the border country. Clarence Rode and his son hidden for 21 years on an open mountainside inside the search grid, proof that looking is not the same as finding. Michael Lemaitre, gone from a crowded mountain above a town on the biggest day of its year. Thomas Seibold, gone from a quiet cabin on the Ambler at Freeze Up. Florence Okpealuk, gone from a beach in Nome, her shoes still in the tent, her case still open, still solvable. And Gary Southerden, the one the land gave back, 46 years late. The triangle on the map is a human invention. You will not find its borders in any geology textbook, and I will not pretend to you that some force inside those lines pulls people out of the world. What is real is harder. What is real is a landscape so large, so cold, and so patient that it does not need to be mysterious to be merciless, and a set of families from Louisiana to Wisconsin to Nome who learned that the hardest word in the English language is not death, it is missing. The ice is still moving down there between Anchorage and Juneau, an inch at a time, carrying whatever it carries toward the sea. One day it may open its hand. When it does, we will cover it here. If these stories matter to you, and especially if hearing Florence's name tonight moves even one person in Western Alaska to say what they know, then this episode did its work. Subscribe if you want to walk the next case with me. Leave a like so these names travel a little further, and I will meet you again, out past the tree line.